November 1950. United Nations forces advance through frozen North Korean mountains toward the Chinese border. General Douglas MacArthur has just told his soldiers they will be home by Christmas. In Washington, leaders believe the Korean War is nearly won. But in Beijing, Mao Zedong sits with maps of Korea spread before him and says nothing. He does not need to speak. 300,000 Chinese soldiers are already crossing the Yalu River in darkness, moving through mountain passes the Americans believe are empty. MacArthur sees the end of a war. Mao sees the beginning of something else entirely. The distance between Tokyo headquarters and the frozen Chosin Reservoir is measured in miles. The distance between American confidence and Chinese preparation is measured in something far greater. What Mao says in this moment will not be a warning. It will be an answer to a question MacArthur never thought to ask. If you want to discover more moments when MacArthur's certainty collided with reality, subscribe now. October 1950. MacArthur stands on the beach at Incheon weeks after his impossible amphibious landing succeeded beyond even his own predictions. Seoul has been liberated. North Korean forces are collapsing in retreat. The war that began in disaster has been reversed through audacity and brilliance. MacArthur sees the momentum and believes it cannot be stopped. He orders United Nations forces to push north beyond the 38th parallel, beyond the original objective of restoring South Korea, toward the Yalu River, and complete unification of the peninsula under democratic rule. When political leaders in Washington express concern about Chinese reaction, MacArthur dismisses the warnings. His intelligence officers assure him that China will not intervene. If they do, American air power will destroy them before they can affect the outcome. MacArthur flies to Wake Island to meet President Truman and promises that resistance will end soon. The soldiers will be home for Christmas. He returns to Tokyo convinced of his own assessment and certain that nothing can prevent the conclusion he has already determined. But Mao Zedong sees the same maps from a different perspective. He watches American forces drive north and recognizes that this is not simply about Korea. If the Americans reach the Yalu River and establish a unified Korea under their influence, China faces a hostile military power directly on its border. The revolution that brought communism to China is barely 1 year old. The country is exhausted from decades of civil war and Japanese occupation. The economy is devastated. The military has limited modern equipment. By every conventional measure, confronting American military power seems impossible. But Mao has spent decades fighting wars that conventional thinking said could not be won. He defeated nationalist forces that had superior equipment and American support. He survived Long March that should have destroyed his movement. He understands something about warfare that MacArthur's technological superiority cannot account for. He understands that will and sacrifice can overcome material advantage when the stakes are existential and the commitment is absolute. In meetings with his military commanders and political leadership, Mao makes clear that China cannot allow American forces to occupy all of Korea. The arguments against intervention are substantial. Stalin promises Soviet air support, but everyone knows Stalin's promises are unreliable. The Chinese military needs time to recover from years of war. The risk of direct confrontation with American military power seems catastrophic, but Mao's reasoning operates from different premises than the calculations happening in Tokyo and Washington. He argues that if China does not act now, America will not stop at the Yalu River. A unified Korea under American influence becomes a permanent threat that will never diminish. Fighting now, when American forces are overextended and overconfident, offers better odds than waiting until America consolidates control and turns its attention to pressuring China itself. The decision to intervene is not irrational gambling. It is strategic calculation based on understanding that some threats must be confronted immediately regardless of cost, because the alternative is worse. What Mao says to his commanders is not recorded with the dramatic flourish of MacArthur's pronouncements. Chinese decision-making happens in closed rooms with careful deliberation rather than bold public declarations. But the essence of Mao's position is clear from what follows. He tells his generals that American forces believe their technological superiority makes them invincible. This belief is their greatest vulnerability. The Americans expect conventional warfare where their advantages in air power, artillery, and logistics determine outcomes. Instead, China will fight a different kind of war. Chinese forces will move at night. They will avoid American air power by hiding during daylight and attacking when darkness neutralizes American technological advantages. They will accept casualties that American forces cannot imagine enduring. They will use terrain and winter weather as weapons that American equipment cannot overcome. They will prove that will and sacrifice matter more than firepower when the commitment is total and the cause is survival. The Chinese intervention begins on October 25, 1950, though American forces do not recognize the scale of what is happening. Initial reports of Chinese soldiers are dismissed as small volunteer units, not evidence of massive military operation. MacArthur's intelligence continues to assure him that major Chinese intervention is unlikely. He pushes his forces toward the Yalu River, splitting his army into separated columns, advancing through mountainous terrain where they cannot easily support each other. The momentum of victory drives decisions that tactical caution might have prevented. When American units encounter Chinese forces and report being badly outnumbered, headquarters assumes the reports are exaggerated by the confusion of combat. The possibility that 300,000 Chinese soldiers have infiltrated into North Korea without detection seems impossible. MacArthur's certainty that China would not dare intervene has become assumption so firm that evidence contradicting it is reinterpreted to fit the established narrative. But Mao's strategy is working exactly as planned. Chinese forces have crossed the Yalu River over several weeks, moving only at night through mountain passes, hiding in villages and tunnels during daylight to avoid American reconnaissance aircraft. The infiltration achieves complete surprise not through deception, but through exploiting what MacArthur cannot imagine. The American military, with its sophisticated intelligence apparatus and technological superiority, cannot conceive that an enemy could move such massive forces undetected. The assumption that this is impossible makes the Americans blind to the reality, even when evidence appears. Chinese soldiers live in conditions American troops would consider unbearable. They carry minimal supplies and plan to capture American equipment for food and ammunition. They accept tactical circumstances that Western military doctrine would reject as suicidal. This willingness to endure what Americans will not endure becomes strategic advantage that technology cannot overcome. November 24, 1950. MacArthur launches what he intends as the final offensive that will end the war. United Nations forces advance on multiple fronts toward the Yalu River. MacArthur flies over the battlefield and sees his forces moving north against minimal resistance. He returns to Tokyo and makes his Christmas promise public. The war is won. The soldiers will be home soon. The nightmare of summer 1950, when North Korean forces nearly pushed United Nations troops off the peninsula entirely, has been overcome through brilliant strategy and American military power. MacArthur has proven his critics wrong and vindicated his aggressive approach. In Washington, officials who worried about Chinese intervention breathe easier. Perhaps the intelligence assessments were correct. Perhaps China understood that challenging American military power would be futile. Perhaps MacArthur's confidence was justified all along. On November 25th, the Chinese counterattack begins. Across the entire front, United Nations forces find themselves suddenly surrounded by overwhelming numbers of enemy soldiers who seem to materialize from nowhere. American units that thought they faced scattered resistance discover they are outnumbered 10-1. The fighting is brutal and close range. Chinese tactics emphasize night attacks and infiltration, getting inside American defensive positions before firepower advantages can be brought to bear. American soldiers, many of them recent recruits who have not experienced intense combat, find themselves in desperate fights for survival against an enemy who attacks in waves and accepts casualties that seem incomprehensible. The reports flooding into headquarters contradict everything MacArthur believed about the situation. The scale of Chinese forces proves that this is not limited intervention. This is major military operation that has been planned and prepared while MacArthur advanced confidently toward victory. The Chosin Reservoir becomes the symbol of how completely MacArthur's assumptions were wrong. American and United Nations forces, surrounded by Chinese troops in frozen mountains, fight for survival rather than victory. The temperature drops to 20 degrees below zero. Equipment fails in the cold. Soldiers suffer frostbite and hypothermia. Wounded men die before they can be evacuated. The Marines and Army units surrounded at Chosin fight their way back toward the coast in what becomes the longest retreat in American military history. They survive through courage and discipline that MacArthur's confidence in easy victory did not prepare them for. The promise that they would be home by Christmas becomes bitter irony as they fight just to avoid annihilation in conditions that make warfare almost unendurable. The Chinese forces accept horrific casualties to maintain pressure. Chinese soldiers freeze to death in attack positions. holding their rifles ready to fire even after death. This level of sacrifice demonstrates commitment that American military planning did not account for because it seemed beyond rational military calculation. MacArthur's response to the Chinese intervention reveals both his strengths and his fatal flaw. He immediately recognizes that the situation has changed, fundamentally. The war he thought was ending has expanded into something far larger and more dangerous. His strategic mind grasps that fighting China in the mountains of North Korea means fighting the world's most populous nation in conditions that favor their strengths and neutralize American advantages. He begins advocating for dramatic escalation, including bombing Chinese territory and using nuclear weapons to offset Chinese numerical superiority. He argues that the only alternative to escalation is accepting defeat, and that accepting defeat in Korea will encourage communist aggression throughout Asia. His logic is consistent with his character. If war is worth fighting, it is worth fighting to win with every available weapon. Limited war with self-imposed restrictions makes no sense to someone whose career was built on total commitment and decisive action. But this same certainty that drives MacArthur to advocate for escalation is what made him vulnerable to surprise in the first place. His belief that China would not intervene was not based on careful intelligence assessment. It was based on his assumption that his assessment must be correct because he understood Asian politics better than anyone else. When evidence appeared that contradicted his assumptions, he dismissed it as impossible rather than revising his understanding. This pattern repeats throughout his response to Chinese intervention. He argues for strategies that Washington considers reckless, and when his recommendations are rejected, he publicly criticizes the political limitations that prevent military victory. His brilliance as strategist cannot accommodate the possibility that his strategic vision might be wrong or that others might see factors he is missing. Mao, watching the American retreat from Beijing, understands that China has achieved its essential objective. American forces are being pushed back from the Chinese border. The immediate threat of hostile American military power directly adjacent to Chinese territory has been prevented. Chinese intervention has demonstrated that American military power, while formidable, is not unlimited. Asian nations watching the conflict now see that the United States can be fought to stalemate by determined forces willing to accept costs that Americans will not endure. The propaganda value of defeating American forces, even temporarily, cannot be overstated for communist movements throughout Asia. Mao has paid an enormous price in Chinese casualties. The war will continue for years with hundreds of thousands more deaths. But from Mao's strategic perspective, the intervention has achieved what was necessary. China has proven it will defend its interests against any threat, regardless of the power of the adversary. What Mao said when MacArthur promised soldiers would be home by Christmas was spoken not in public pronouncements, but in actions that required no words. While MacArthur talked about easy victory, Mao prepared for hard war. While MacArthur assumed technological superiority would determine outcomes, Mao organized human will and sacrifice as weapons that technology could not defeat. While MacArthur looked at maps and saw inevitable success, Mao looked at the same maps and saw opportunity to exploit overconfidence. The contrast between them is not simply about military strategy. It is about fundamentally different understandings of what warfare is. For MacArthur, warfare is about applying superior power to achieve political objectives. For Mao, warfare is about will and sacrifice, and victory belongs to whoever is willing to pay the higher price for their objectives. The lessons from this confrontation remain relevant because they expose recurring patterns in how powerful nations understand conflict. Technological superiority creates confidence that can become blindness. The assumption that enemies will make rational calculations based on material strength ignores that different actors define rationality differently. What seems irrational from one perspective, such as accepting massive casualties to prevent American forces from reaching your border, makes perfect sense from another perspective where the alternative is worse. MacArthur was not stupid to believe China would not intervene. His assessment was based on logical analysis of Chinese weaknesses and American strengths. But his logic operated from premises that did not account for how Mao calculated costs and benefits. The result was strategic surprise that changed the war and ultimately contributed to MacArthur being relieved of command when his recommendations for escalation were rejected by political leaders who feared his approach would start World War III. The Korean War settles into stalemate along the 38th parallel after the initial Chinese intervention pushes United Nations forces back south. The war continues for 2 more years with enormous casualties on all sides, but without decisive breakthrough by either side. MacArthur's prediction that soldiers would be home by Christmas becomes symbol of overconfidence that defined his approach to Korea. He is relieved of command in April 1951, when his public disagreements with President Truman over strategy become intolerable to civilian leadership. He returns to America as controversial figure, celebrated by many as hero who was prevented from winning the war by political restrictions, criticized by others as general whose certainty led to catastrophic surprise and whose recommendations risked global nuclear war. Mao's intervention in Korea is vindicated by the outcome from Chinese perspective. Korea remains divided, but Chinese border security is preserved. The war establishes China as major military power that successfully confronted American forces. The cost is staggering, with hundreds of thousands of Chinese casualties, but Mao's strategic calculation prioritized preventing American military presence on Chinese border over minimizing casualties. For Mao, this trade-off is acceptable because it achieves core security objective and demonstrates Chinese willingness to defend interests regardless of cost. The war also strengthens Mao's domestic position by unifying Chinese population around external threat and proving the revolution can defend itself against most powerful capitalist nation. These outcomes justify the intervention in Chinese strategic thinking, even though the human cost was horrific. The fundamental question is whether MacArthur's surprise could have been avoided. Intelligence about Chinese troop movements existed, but was dismissed as unlikely to represent major intervention. American reconnaissance failed to detect the scale of Chinese infiltration because Chinese tactics were designed specifically to exploit American technological dependence. Even when American units encountered Chinese forces and reported being outnumbered, headquarters interpreted this as localized situation rather than evidence of massive operation. The failure was not lack of information, but inability to believe that China would do what it was actually doing. MacArthur's certainty that Chinese intervention was irrational created filter through which all evidence was interpreted. Information that confirmed his assumptions was accepted. Information that contradicted his assumptions was dismissed as exaggerated or anomalous. This pattern of surprise through certainty repeats throughout military history. Leaders who are certain they understand the situation become vulnerable to adversaries who act in ways the certain leader considers impossible. The solution is not simply better intelligence, though better intelligence helps. The solution requires intellectual humility to consider that one's understanding might be wrong, even when logic and experience support current assessment. MacArthur was a brilliant strategist whose career demonstrated exceptional military judgment, but his brilliance became limitation when it hardened into certainty that could not accommodate alternative possibilities. Mao exploited this not through deception, but through doing exactly what MacArthur considered impossible. The lesson for strategic thinking is that confidence must be tempered by awareness that adversaries may calculate differently than you expect, and that what seems irrational from your perspective may be entirely rational from theirs. The Christmas promise that MacArthur made represents more than failed prediction. It represents a moment when confidence became detachment from reality, when the momentum of success created blindness to approaching disaster, when certainty about enemy limitations prevented recognition that those limitations might not apply. Mao did not need to say anything when MacArthur made his promise. He simply prepared to answer with force what MacArthur assumed was already decided. The collision between MacArthur's confidence and Mao's preparation created one of the most significant military surprises of the 20th century, and demonstrated that willpower and sacrifice can defeat technological superiority when the commitment is absolute and the stakes are understood as existential. What Mao said was spoken through actions rather than words, and the message was clear. We will not allow American forces on our border regardless of cost, regardless of your confidence, regardless of your assumptions about what we dare not do. The Korean War never formally ended. The armistice signed in July 1953 created ceasefire that persists 7 decades later, with Korean Peninsula still divided and American forces still stationed in South Korea. The war MacArthur thought would end by Christmas 1950 is technically still ongoing, frozen in stalemate that neither side could break through military force. The costs were staggering. Over 36,000 American soldiers died. Chinese casualties numbered in hundreds of thousands. Korean civilian deaths reached millions. The war that began as limited conflict to restore South Korean sovereignty became grinding attritional struggle that demonstrated the limits of American military power against determined opposition willing to accept casualties that Western nations would not endure. For MacArthur, the Korean War marked the end of his legendary military career. His relief from command in 1951 came after months of public disagreement with Truman administration over strategy and his repeated advocacy for escalation that political leaders feared would trigger World War III. He returned to America and faded from public life, giving speeches and offering commentary, but never again wielding the power and authority that had defined his career from World War I through World War II and into Korea. His final years were spent defending his record and arguing that political restrictions prevented military victory in Korea. He died in 1964, still convinced that his strategic vision had been correct and that failure in Korea resulted from politicians who lacked the courage to authorize the decisive action he recommended. Mao's legacy is more complex and far more controversial. He led China until his death in 1976, presiding over transformations that lifted millions from poverty, while also creating catastrophes like the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution that killed tens of millions. His decision to intervene in Korea is remembered in China as a moment when the new communist government proved it could defend Chinese interests against most powerful nation on earth. The enormous casualties are acknowledged but justified as necessary price for security and international respect. In Western historical memory, Mao is remembered as dictator responsible for massive human suffering. But his strategic acumen in Korea is recognized even by those who condemn his political legacy. He understood what MacArthur did not, that technological superiority creates confidence that can be exploited by adversaries willing to fight differently than expected. The Christmas promise and its aftermath offer lessons that extend beyond military strategy into broader questions about confidence, certainty, and the limits of power. MacArthur's confidence was not irrational. American military power was overwhelming by any conventional measure. Chinese interventions seemed to violate logic of material strength determining outcomes, but Mao operated from different logic where political will and national survival outweighed material calculations. This clash of different rationalities produced surprise that changed the war and ultimately contributed to strategic stalemate that neither side could break. The question for contemporary strategy is whether current leaders understand that adversaries may calculate costs and benefits from premises that make Western strategic logic seem irrelevant. Technological superiority remains important, but MacArthur's surprise in Korea demonstrates that superiority creates vulnerabilities when it breeds certainty that enemy will not do what enemy considers necessary. What Mao said when MacArthur promised they would be home by Christmas was not words, but decision translated into action through months of careful preparation and then sudden violent execution. He said that China would not accept American military power on its border regardless of cost. He said that Asian nations need not fear American technological superiority if they were willing to fight on terms that neutralize that superiority. He said that confidence without humility creates vulnerability that can be exploited by adversaries who see opportunity where the confident leader sees impossibility. The collision between MacArthur's promise and Mao's answer produced one of the defining conflicts of the Cold War and demonstrated truths about warfare that remain relevant whenever superior military power confronts determined resistance willing to accept costs that conventional calculation considers irrational. The soldiers did not come home by Christmas. Many never came home at all. The promise became a cautionary tale about the distance between confidence and reality, between assumption and truth, between what leaders believe and what actually is. If these warnings from history matter to you, subscribe to see more moments when certainty met reality.